Okay, just to see what we have to begin with. So here's our animation. For this one, I only rendered just a quick 10 frames just to keep things moving along a little bit faster on my end. But you can see definitely lots of flickering, especially back here in the back. Definitely lots of chattering and other jittering effects down here in the contact shadows. So again, this scenario where I'm using just these luminance planes to light my scene, it's a really, really good way of, like I said, just getting some bad noise artifacts that we can come in here and start to work on smoothing out. Now, this is probably some of the settings that you're going to be working with most frequently when it comes to adjusting your final gather and trying to eliminate any sort of artifacts in the renders. So a lot of these settings are really, really critically important. So first we have accuracy. Now this is more or less controlling the number of rays that are coming out from your points. Now below the point density, this is actually controlling the number of points that we have to begin with. Now, both of these can help start to really, really dramatically reduce any sort of artifacting and flickering. The thing is, you sort of need to know when to use each one of these and when not to, because there are some different scenarios where you may want to or may not. So if you start to experience any sort of noise or these types of animation artifacts in your final gather, a couple things to keep in mind. If you are seeing a lot of flickering out sort of in the open areas, where there's really not a whole lot of geometry in these areas, or just a lot of spotting where there really isn't anything that should be blocking the light, typically the more detailed your lighting results, the more final gather rays that you'll need in order to make sure that that renders out without any sort of flickering. Now, on the flip side, if you start to notice a lot of chattering and a lot of artifacts underneath, maybe in the contact areas of your geometry, or underneath certain overhangs or on parts of your geometry, usually more detailed geometry is going to require more final gather points to get something that's flicker free. Now, in my scenario, you can see where a lot of the flickering is happening out here, so this probably doesn't have to do with an insufficient number of points. This really has to do with probably an incorrect calculation that's being returned by the rays. So again, if we start to experience flickering out in these open areas, typically we're going to have to increase the number of rays. So the reason that this happens is that whenever these final gather points are cast out into my scene and these rays are reaching out to the environment, the rays are reaching out and seeing these really, really bright luminance planes. Now those rays return that information back to the point, which shades it sort of brightly, and that's where we're getting sort of these lighting effects, or sort of these false lighting effects from these planes when there's really no light whatsoever in the scene. Now the problem is, from one frame to the next, remember, as we talked about in our previous lesson, these rays are being shot out in all different random directions. So from one frame, we might get a certain shading point that's returned back to that original point. But in the next frame, with the rays being sent out in a completely different direction, the lighting result may look completely different on the next frame. And that's where we start to get sort of those artifacts and other noise. So what we want to do in a situation like this is send out more rays. So more rays will give us a much, much better average of the total lighting of the environment. And with sending out more rays, getting a better average means we're going to get a much more predictable result from frame to frame. So the way we can start to fix this is, let's take our accuracy and bump this up. Now, the setting that you will need to use for your particular scenes can vary incredibly from the type of lighting that you have, the type of objects that you have. Every scene is going to be a little bit different. In my case, I'll try something like 500, although you may have to go much, much higher if you have really, really detailed lighting results that you need to capture. So for this, let's maybe just do another quick batch render for that. In my case, that's already looking quite a bit better. You can see now much less of this blotchiness that's happening back here in the background. Still a little bit. And we do still have a little bit of artifacting that's happening sort of here in these contact shadows. So at least we're on the right track. No matter where you start to experience blotching in your scenes, even if it's an open area or if you're starting to notice it along your geometry, typically, the first thing that I would do is to try increasing your accuracy to see if that helps. If you still start to wind up with artifacting, then especially in areas of really detailed geometry, then that's when you'll probably want to start to increase your point density a little bit. But again, keep in mind that increasing both of these values can very seriously increase your render time as well. So if you can, as you're testing this out, try to do sort of like what I'm doing. Boost these values up at small increments and then just render maybe 10 frames at a time, even on just half resolution, and that way you can get your testing process happening much faster. Now, in addition to the accuracy and smoothing out some of those results, we can also help this with the point interpolation. So the point interpolation is basically allowing the final gather points to look at their neighboring points and sort of average that lighting information together to arrive at its final lighting result. Now, right now it's set to look at about 10 neighbors. Now, what we could do is start to increase this value so that way each one of our final gather points is looking at a higher number of its neighboring points and getting maybe just a little bit better average of the overall illumination. Now, the beauty of this is that it does do a really nice job of smoothing out our final gather results without having to sometimes come in and take our accuracy just ridiculously high. The problem, though, is that as we start to introduce some of this point interpolation, we can sometimes start to lose details in some of the contact shadows and other really sharp final gather areas because it is tending to blur those results out a little bit more. But really, as long as you're not losing too much of the detail, a lot of times those little contact shadows and other small little details are a lot easier and a lot more predictable to capture with something like ambient occlusion. So you could still take these results at very low quality settings and very blurred out final gather results, and then just use ambient occlusion to help get some of those little contact shadows back in place. That's going to be much easier, much faster to render as well, because ambient occlusion is a really fast thing to render out. So as we start to introduce maybe a little bit higher point interpolation, another really valuable setting to get into is going to be found inside your final gather quality rollout. Now, that's this little sort of unassuming attribute right here called filter. Now, what filter will try to do is look at sort of an average of our final gather result, and it'll try to identify maybe areas that are exceptionally bright or areas that may be exceptionally dark, and it'll try to basically eliminate those and try to keep those from factoring in. So if we start to wind up with some really unusual spotting or splotchiness that happens, especially when using maybe things like HDR images or the IBL dome, which we'll look at in one of our later lessons, this can be really useful for helping to reduce some of these really bright spots that you might start to get, which again can be a real problem and a real factor in your flickering. So usually I find myself coming in and using a final gather filter of 1, maybe 2 for extreme situations, but usually I find that 1 has a pretty nice result. So if I come in and save that image for comparison, let's see if we can tell a difference after introducing a little bit more of this filtering in here. So in this case, it doesn't really make a huge impact on the overall lighting, but increasing this accuracy, increasing my point interpolation, even on just this still image, you can see that there is a lot less blotchiness now on this still image compared to what we had before. So now, if we want, we can come in and just do another quick batch render to see what we have now. And once that finishes up, we can see that our final gather flickering is now very minimal. Like I said, from a purely technical point of view, there is still flickering in this image. There's no way that we can completely eliminate any flickering effects, but what we can do is minimize those to the point where visually we can't really tell that there's any flickering at all happening. So, as I mentioned, depending on your particular scene, the objects, the lighting that you have, you may wind up having to use some higher values, but typically by increasing your accuracy, your point density, and your interpolation, and then starting to introduce a little bit of filtering, some combination of these attributes can usually eliminate just about any type of final gathering artifacts.